clerk please call the roll? I'm here.
Councilmember Austin Lane. Present. Councilmember Berry. Here. Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Eldridge. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
And Councilmember Williams.
Here.
There's a quorum of the council present. Are there any council comments or announcements?
Just one thing that I'm hoping we have not lost sight of, and that is the Piney Branch parking issue. It may be on the upcoming agenda, but I did not see it.
Do you want to?
Yes, I can give the council an update on that. The state has confirmed that they basically do not allow restricted permit parking on state roads. We have conveyed that information to Mr. Solomon. We are trying to identify some other options that may provide some relief to the residents.
And I believe one of those options was 2-hour metered parking.
We've had some discussions amongst the staff about that proposal, Councilmember Austin Lane. Our concern is that if we were to put 2-hour parking in, that may actually inconvenience some of the residents who use the street.
Could they have a resident parking sticker? So
that's permit parking.
Yeah.
Well, but if it was 2-hour meters, then it would be our decision as a city how to enforce that 2-hour meter. And if somebody had a resident sticker, then they wouldn't be ticketed.
Yeah, it's certainly something we can keep exploring. What Ms. Braithwaite and Ms. Carpenter and I have discussed is that as we move forward with some of the options where it's unclear whether or not that would actually help or harm the residents, that we'd want to have some direct conversation with them about that.
I appreciate that, and I would like to help make that happen in whatever way I can. I'm especially sensitive to Mr. Solomon's complaint that we were slow in responding to him, and so I'd like to make sure that we don't continue that trend. If it's something that we can address early in January, that would be welcome. But it does look to me like we're putting it off until the next calendar year.
Some of the steps that are being taken, and this has been conveyed to Mr. Solomon, I'll be happy to share those emails with you, Councilmember Austin Lane. I think we may have neglected to include you on those. We're moving forward with painting some of the areas around the residents' driveways because there was some concern that there wasn't the adequate distance and they were getting blocked in. Based on the last email that I saw with Mr. Solomon, he seemed happy with at least the progress we were making at this point and trying to identify some options, and I will send those emails to you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention on it.
Any other comments or announcements? Bruce?
Yes, I just wanted to let everybody know that I was in Houston the last 4 days attending I have to remember what the new name is because the organization changed the name, the International Gay and Lesbian Leadership Conference. And among a number of interesting things that transpired there, one that has particular relevance for Tacoma Park was that at a reception thrown by the mayor of Houston, Bill White, when he was talking to me, he looked at my name tag, noticed Tacoma Park, and said, "Oh, I used to live there." He said, "I lived there 30 years ago when they were building the metro station. I lived 2 blocks from the metro."
Oh, what do you know about green space?
I don't know. He couldn't remember the name of the street where he lived, so that may not help. And I also just wanted to alert folks that I know a number of us have had some discussions with members of the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee, and in my discussions last week, I thought it would be helpful to maybe for council members to attend some committee meetings, and so I'm going to try and go to the Public Safety Committee meeting this week.
Okay. When is it?
Wednesday at 6:30.
Okay.
So I'd be happy to attend and provide any feedback.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Pat Lovelace, who is usually here for the public comment session, is out of town with family for the holiday, but he was very disappointed he was going to miss the discussion on rent stabilization and wanted me to encourage my colleagues to keep the low-income residents of the city in mind as we discuss rent stabilization.
I wanted to say that leaf pickup in my area is going very well this year. may recall that when I first started this council last year, it seemed like the entirety of my job was going to be about leaf collection and the problems with leaf collection. And so I'm happy to report that it's going very well this year. One of the issues that's come up in Long Branch Sligo is there's a stop sign question at the corner of Jackson and Hilton that people have been kind of loosely discussing, but it sort of brings me back to the issue that we had some money in the budget to do some comprehensive traffic planning, and I really think that Long Branch Sligo in particular is really ready to go, and it's probably a great place to do one of the first activities because it's kind of its own space. You know, if you come over into the portion of the neighborhood where I live, we're connected to part of Ward 3 all the way over to Carroll, and Elm kind of connects us through to Forest Park, and there's lots of things going on there. And those areas need some traffic issues as well, but I think Long Branch Sligo would be just a great place maybe to go in and do the first activity that we're going to do. So, also there was a report on the listserv about graffiti in that park where Flower crosses over Sligo, and some concern about whether or not it's gang graffiti or just plain old mischievous graffiti, and the police liaison for that Long Branch Sligo area, the person who lives in the neighborhood called the park police and was talking to somebody there about that. So I think we'll wait and see what the park police have to say. They were going to have someone come out and kind of look at it, engage it, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. And the last thing is that my parents are visiting from California, which I'm very happy about, but it also means that my children are staying up late, so I would like to remind them to go to bed.
A couple more things. One is I wanted to update the council on the situation with 7133 Carroll, where the Hevia family is moving, and I believe that everything has now been finalized with their settlement. They moved, and there are a few outstanding issues with the site meets and bounds, but other than that, I believe we have made a successful transition of ownership from county to the Hevia family, and in my mind, that is one of the critical steps on the way to rebuilding our fire station. So I'm very pleased that we've gotten to this point. Another thing that I wanted to give council members a heads up about is that in a 2-week period on December 1st, Jamie Raskin, who will be our state senator in District 20 in next year's state legislative session, is holding a state health policy forum where he will be inviting new legislators and, current legislators, but it's mainly for new ones who will need to get up to speed on health policy, and he's having speakers who can help do that, to a forum that's going to be held at Montgomery College in the Health Sciences building. So I'm very pleased that District 20 and Tacoma Park can be part of hosting that, and all are welcome to attend. It's December 1st. I believe it starts at noon.
All right. The next item on the agenda is the public comment period. This is the time that's set aside on the agenda for comments on items that are not on our special session agenda today. That would include anything on our work session agenda or anything else you'd like to bring before the council. When you come forward to speak, if you could identify yourself and if you can keep your comments to 3 minutes, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Alan Henney from Prince George's Avenue. I just want to touch briefly on an incident that happened last week, not too far from where we live. And so, listed on the prime blotter on Friday on the police department's email list about a sexual assault that happened on Eastern Avenue. Happened on Wednesday. And what I find so disturbing is this is the very first acknowledgement we had from the police department on Friday, about 2 days after the sex assault from an unknown, seemingly an unknown attacker, and the description is fairly specific. And I find it disturbing. I don't know if anyone's from the police department here tonight who can speak for the police department, but we had 48 hours with no notification from the police department. The well-publicized Tacoma alert list, nothing on that, or on the COG version. So I find that quite frustrating. And furthermore, When such an incident like this comes across, the police get a call for rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and it's along the border, Eastern Avenue, New Hampshire Avenue, University Boulevard. If it were up to me, that call should go also out to the adjacent jurisdiction. In this case, D.C. police didn't get the call until Tacoma Park got on the scene, verified the incident, told the dispatcher to call the D.C. dispatcher to pass along the lookout and the description. 8 minutes went by. D.C. police did put it out. Tacoma Park also asked that Prince George's County police be notified. They were never notified. They were perhaps notified, I don't know. It just never came out on the radio. This problem with interoperability was supposed to have been solved years ago when they had the new radio systems, and we're still there today. And, I hope that the council will follow this up with the police department and bring it to some resolution.
Okay, thank you.
I can certainly follow up with Acting Chief Coursey. My recollection is that I believed I saw a notification, sir, on the alert within the following day, but I'd certainly be happy to check that out. I'm not professing to have a totally clear recollection of the dates and times. If before you leave tonight, if you could maybe stop by and just give me your name and telephone number, I'd be happy to follow up with you directly as well.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Mark Hessel. I'm an attorney. I represent landlords in Tacoma Park. I wanted to comment briefly on the general shape of the preliminary report that Ken Barr submitted for the council's consideration tonight. I think it's a good report, but I think it leaves a lot of questions unanswered or unaddressed. It doesn't talk about the elephant sitting in the corner of the room, which is the question of should there be rent control in the first place? What should the goals of the rent control be? How many affordable housing units should there be? What's an affordable housing unit? These are the same issues that have been raised from time to time over the last 9 months, but never really addressed. The report was put together by Mr. Barr without a council vote on what the parameters ought to be. I know there was some direction from informal discussion with the council from the September 25th council work session. But there haven't been any votes on the big questions. And the biggest issues are, in my mind, can Tacoma Park provide sustainable, affordable housing under this system? Or is it a system that's eventually going to collapse, and if the city hasn't laid the groundwork for sustainable, affordable housing, it's going to end up with next to nothing someday. At this point, more and more landlords continue to talk to me and to other attorneys about converting to condominium. And if you lose 100 units a year for just 15 years, which is a fraction of the age of rent control in the city, you're going to end up with relatively little rental housing at all in the city. There have to be incentives in here for landlords to remain landlords and not developers. And the report doesn't address that at all. It's not a criticism of Mr. Barr, but it's a lacking in the general structure of what he was charged to do. And there still hasn't been any discussion of the cost of rent control, the social impact. I tend to think it'll destroy the middle class of Tacoma Park. I think you end up with relatively wealthy people owning single-family homes, and you have people living in the rental housing. I also think that you can have some interesting results of more and more tenant associations buying their own buildings, which I think is great. But if they later cash in on it and sell and walk away with the profits, Tacoma Park doesn't have that sustainable, affordable housing any longer. And there's the fair return concept in here, which I haven't really nailed down. I spoke with Mr. Barr for almost an hour today. But the fair return concept seems to be not based on this is how much an owner of a building has invested in the property, and he should get...
Can you wind up your comment?
Yes. He should get X% return on his investment, but rather on sustaining an annual increase in the net operating income. That's fine if the net operating income you're adjusting from is a fair and reasonable net operating income. but the report doesn't really address where you started from. So I
Can
think
you
there's
run
a
it through
lot
comments?
here that the council needs to address
I'd like
above
to-
and beyond what's on the report.
I'd just like to ask a question about one thing that you said. You talked about a sustainable system. What, in your opinion, would a sustainable system look like?
I think it would have a lot of the features that were discussed at the seminar back in, I think, June or May that was conducted right here. And it has a lot of facets to it. It could be a certain amount with land trusts. It could be using money raised from various sources to subsidize nonprofits, like the pilot program, which you've done a couple of in the last few months. I will tell you straight out, I don't know it all. But I think the city, you spent whatever the amount was hiring Mr. Barr to draft legislation. The council ought to, in my view, ought to be hiring somebody who really knows nonprofits and government programs and affordable housing and what can be done and what it costs and how long it takes and what the income streams need to look like. Somebody ought to be looking at that and saying, you know, if the city had $1 million a year to spend, this is what it could do over the next decade, which would have be self-perpetuating for the next 50 years or longer. I don't know what those numbers look like, but my sense is that there's a lot that can be done. And it may be a question of how you get that money together initially, what you can expect for tax revenue increases. I mean, if Tacoma Park did away with rent control tomorrow, property values would go up for the rental properties, but the city wouldn't have any revenue from it for 4 years because you just had an assessment. The new assessment won't kick in for another 3 years and 6 weeks, and the property taxes won't come due for another 6 months after that, and no one will pay them until September 2010 because that's when the late fees start kicking in. So there are a lot of considerations like that, and I think it behooves the city, given the importance of this issue, $12 million a year item, to spend a little money talking to some people who really know this stuff. Thank you.
Since you bring that up, I just wanted to note that the council will be discussing a proposal for modifications to the rent stabilization system this evening. We are having a public hearing on these proposals, and any ideas the council have for changing the proposals on the 11th of December. There's a formal public hearing on this for the 11th of December. So just, you gave me an opportunity to point out that we are having a public hearing on these proposals in a couple of weeks. Anybody else? All right, we will move on to the city manager's update.
Just a couple items regarding the community center project I wanted to share with the council. I feel like this is sort of becoming a broken record, but we're continuing our efforts to resolve all the outstanding issues on phase one. As I mentioned last week, we did ask the design team to do a re-inspection so that we could update the punch list. That was done last Wednesday. And as soon as I receive the report and have had an opportunity to review that, we will be following up with James F. Knott Construction. Along those same lines, we are very close to finally, we believe, resolving the settlement agreement with PowerMax, which, as the council may recall, is a mechanical subcontractor to James F. Knott on phase one. One of the items that we have been having some discussion with James F. Knott Construction about, which the council may recall, is the flooring on the in the public safety plaza area. We had asked for a test section to be redone based on some cracks we had noticed in the Fritz tile. They did start to basically redo that test area when we did notice some additional cracks from when that first item was first identified. At that point, we did ask them to cease work, so if you sort of see that ugly bear area on the public safety area, that was actually left at the city's request. We are having some discussions with our own in-house engineer as well as some other members of the design team about whether or not we should be examining perhaps some other type of flooring material. Fritz tile, as I now know more about it than I ever cared to, is a very thin tile that doesn't have a lot of flexibility, so in the long run it may be prone to more cracking than you might see in some other types of flooring materials. So we basically are continuing to research that issue and certainly as more information becomes available, we'll share that with the council. The last item I had regarding the community center project is just to, for the more benefit of the public, is to remind you about the gym feasibility study is in. It is now available on the city's website. It is a rather large document, so it's been broken down into segments, so hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for anyone who wishes to download it and print it. AMC Architects, which is the firm that prepared the gym feasibility study, will be making a presentation tomorrow evening to the Community Center Liaison Committee. That meeting will be at 7:30 p.m. in the Azalea Room. There are also scheduled to basically make a presentation to the City Council on the study on Monday, December 4th, just so for anyone in the public who has an interest in this issue. Are there any other questions about the Community Center before I move on to any other items?
What's the countdown on the elevator cab?
Still moving forward. There'll actually be some electrical work beginning next week, and it is still on track at this point to being in by the end of the year. Just a few other items that might be of interest to the council. I had mentioned last week that we were moving forward in the police chief selection process. I now have firm interview dates that I wanted to share with the council. Those will be December 13th and 14th. It's taking the search firm a little bit longer to finish up some of the background work, and we also had to work around Mr. Mercer's other client commitments, but those dates are firm. The other item I wanted to mention to the council, which will be coming forward at some point in the future, I have been having some discussions with the staff about having Montgomery County enforce recycling rules in multifamily properties in Tacoma Park. There's been some discussions between both our staff and the county staff, and it does appear that there may need to be both a memorandum of understanding and perhaps some amendments to the city's code that would be required to implement this. I have authorized the city attorney's office to have those discussions, and as more information becomes available, it will be coming to you as a work session probably sometime after the first of the year.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Barb, there seems to remain some confusion in the community about the police chief selection and the process, and I just wonder if you could real quickly go through that process to refresh people's minds.
Sure. The chief by the charter is hired by myself. The council did support my recommendation to hire an executive search firm to assist in that process, and the Mercer Group was retained. Working with the Mercer Group, who conducted some interviews with city council members, members of the Public Safety Committee, and other leaders in the community, basically developed a candidate profile that was issued earlier this fall, basically mailed to about 500 individuals, kind of some personal solicitations, as well as advertised in some national publications. The closing date for the position was November 3rd. Mr. Mercer, the head of the Mercer Group, basically kind of pared down that list to somewhat more manageable group, presented those candidates to me. I then, in consultation with him, whittled down the list a little bit further, and we are now in the process of doing background checks on those individuals. I will be having another phone call. I talked to Mr. Mercer today. We'll be also talking to him early next week, at which point we'll narrow the list down to approximately 6 candidates who will be brought into Tacoma Park on the 13th and the 14th to be interviewed.
Thank you very much.
Okay. The last item I had, both for the benefit of the council and for the community, is to just remind everyone that City Hall is closed this Thursday and Friday in observance of the Thanksgiving holiday. In consultation with the Recreation Director, there are no room rentals basically through the holiday weekend, and trying to make the best use we can of taxpayer dollars. There are no room rentals. There are no scheduled recreation programs. So at this point, our plan is to basically be closed through the holiday weekend. And we'll be obviously putting information on the website and posting it on any bulletin boards and getting something out to the listservs accordingly. But I did want to take this opportunity to let everyone know that. That concludes my report, unless there's questions about anything.
Is there any questions from the council? Okay, thank you, Barb. We are moving now to our special session item, which is a resolution making an appointment, the appointment of Wolfgang Merger to the Safe Roadways Committee. This is not an interview situation because he is being appointed as the liaison from the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee to the Safe Roadways Committee. We put it on at the request of the committee because they wanted to have him on and formally appointed to the committee so that he could begin working.
I'd be happy to move it.
Second.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any council discussion on this resolution? We probably should note for the record that Dr. Mergner has, in fact, I think he may have been one of the original members of the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee, and I believe its first chair. So he is well-versed in the concerns of the committee, and I'm sure we're well represented on the Safe Roadways Committee. Any council comments? Any public comments? All right, the question is on the resolution. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The resolution passes, and that's the only item on our special session. What we have is our first work session item. We are trying to work through a number of issues with the committees, and the Noise Control Board, at the interview with several members of the Noise Control Board when you came before us, you raised a number of issues, and we said we would get back to you when we had time for a longer discussion. So if you want to come forward and sit up here, there are a number of issues that you put before the council, and I'll let you go ahead and reiterate your concerns if you'd like to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll start with introductions. Hi, I'm Ellen Fabian, and I am the chair of the Noise Control Board. This is Kathy Burst. She has been a member since, I believe, longer than I have. But you may not remember when that first date was. And this is Steve Davies, who is, I believe, Mayor Porter, this is one of the issues that we wanted to address. He was recruited and invited, and I think he has been through the interview process, but I don't think that he's gotten his formal letter yet.
I don't exactly remember the order of things either, but I do remember there was, in response to the concerns that you expressed, I think we said we would go ahead and work these issues through with you before appointing additional members. That's my recollection.
Okay,
I can't, I wouldn't be 100% sure since my memory is not good, but we would like to work through some of the issues that were raised.
Okay, great. Well, let me just, I'll be very brief, and I guess I've got four or five points to make. We had a really productive meeting with Acting Chief Ed Corsi just about 2 weeks ago. Jesse Carpenter was there, I was there, and Steve Davies was also there. And we had an opportunity to talk about some of the issues that we had talked about, I guess it was last summer. Came up with 4 issues that I wanted to share with you. The first one, and I think I'm right about this, but I may not be, is that I don't think that the noise ordinance, or even the word noise, is appearing on the city's website at all. Is it there when you go to the left side of it, where you have all those various options?
I don't know, but that ought to be something that we can remedy.
Yeah, so anyway, so one of the discussions was that it ought to be there as a click on the website. And then the acting chief had what we thought was a really good suggestion, which was that if it were there as an available option on the website, and if then community members could lodge noise complaints that would be informal noise complaints using the website, kind of a mailbag on the website, that the police then would pick up, and we'd have to go back to the acting chief to ask him how that would happen, but that the police could pick up, and what they would do then on the basis of those complaints received through the website would be to send out the noise ordinance with a kind of an information type of letter to the individual who the complaint was lodged against. The reason for that, Mayor Porter, is that we know anecdotally as a board that there are many more complaints on noise then people are willing to bring two-party complaints to us on, or to even call the police, because I think that people think that that raises the issue or, you know, heightens that person. You lose your anonymity to some extent when you make those complaints, but that people really feel many times, you know, trapped by either barking dog, not major complaints, but by barking dogs, by leaf blowers, and by these kinds of things, that that he felt this may be a way to kind of get to the core of it without totally, satisfy the community on the quality of life issue, and at a very low or no cost kind of option. So that was the first issue, is make sure that noise is on the website and that this may be an option if you agree, if the council agrees, and certainly the acting chief thought it was a good suggestion. The second issue that came up at the meeting was that, is it a possibility to change I guess it would be to change the ordinance so that there would be a range of members on the noise control board from 5 to 7 instead of the 7 that's currently listed. The reason for that is that I don't think that there have ever actually been 7 members on the noise control board. So it's hard for us to reach a quorum, and we couldn't, at that working session, we couldn't think of a reason that would mitigate against the range instead of the absolute number of 7. So we had that recommendation as well. The third recommendation that came out of the meeting then was to have regularly scheduled quarterly meetings that the acting chief could attend, that Jesse would put a year in advance, hopefully, into the city's calendar. The reason for that is so the chief could prepare and present us with the police department's quarterly kind of noise complaint investigation, so that we would have some sense of how much of a problem is this? Are there other ways that we can mitigate it, and that kind of thing? So that seemed to be a really good idea. And finally, then the fifth, or am I up to 4 or 5? I forget. But anyway, yeah, the fifth issue was that the Rudy Rice and me and others of the Noise Control Board who are willing to do it have decided that one of our tasks in terms of raising visibility, because again, we think noise is a bigger issue than the police department is actually getting to. So to raise our visibility would go to some of the meetings of, the WACO, some of the
neighborhood associations,
right.
Yes.
And we had talked about doing that before, but this time, if Jesse can help us by providing a committee support person, very little time, just to help us to get in touch with the email listservs from the community, so that we can make sure that we can get on board, and that either somebody from the police department, probably most appropriately Rudy Rice, would be attending the meetings with me. And then the last issue was committee members, and some need reappointment, which perhaps not, but Steve Davies then needs the appointment. So those were the issues that we talked about. It was really a great meeting, and we really enjoyed having the acting chief there.
Okay. Your suggestions sound very sensible to me. I don't know if I'll give the city manager an opportunity if she sees a problem with any of them.
No, I had had the opportunity to meet with the board maybe a year or so ago, and we had talked a lot about maybe the educational role that the board could fulfill. And I think certainly I'll follow up on the website information tomorrow, but I think they sound like great ideas, and we'd love a chance to work with you a little bit more closely.
I think they all sound like great ideas also, and I particularly like the notion of doing more public education. I do sometimes get complaints from people about noise, barking dogs and various things. And usually when I talk to them about the noise control ordinance, either they have never heard of it or they don't really know what they would do under. They know there's something that says somebody's not supposed to be doing this, but they don't really know what their options are in terms of their doing something to make that happen. And I think that actually may be the biggest problem. That people know that there's some rule about noise, but if there's something that's causing a problem, they don't know how to approach the issue. So I think these are actually very, very good ideas.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Yeah, I appreciate your bringing these ideas forward. They're good ideas. I think a couple of the ideas are things that we talked about just a week or so ago in regard to committees, all committees, not just the noise board, such as the range of membership, and also the idea of having regularly scheduled meetings and discussing when staff members should be there and shouldn't be there. And I think those are good ideas that fall right in line with some of our earlier discussions. Just two things on the website. One, I think we've got to be a little bit careful because we have a lot of committees that everybody's going to want to be on top. So we're going to have to make sure that the web designer does look at the bigger picture, not just try to react to each of the individual requests. But the idea of having a way of reporting things via the website and getting action, I believe we already have that implemented in Alert Tacoma.
Supposedly.
It stinks, it doesn't work, or it hasn't worked. I don't know how it's working now. I entered something about 2 months ago. I haven't gotten a response back from that, so I suspect it still stinks. If I still say that that we should either make Alert Tacoma work, which is a way of reporting noise problems or other problems to the city staff. Either we need to get something that does do that correctly or make Alert Tacoma work. And since we've had that product for a number of years, and I'm not sure how well it's working at this point, Barb, you probably have a much better sense of that. But I really think that in this day and age, there are probably products out there that work pretty well, and I haven't been convinced that's the one.
Just in response, my understanding, and maybe we can get this cleared up, my understanding was that in terms of putting something on the main page of the website, they weren't suggesting that the committee be up there, but they were suggesting that some information about how you deal with a noise complaint be up there. In other words, for example, if you have a complaint about a police issue or something, or I'm trying to think, I can't even think right now what's on the main page, but that the issue of noise and noise complaints and how one deals with them ought to be up there when people are just going to the city's website looking for information on how do I, whatever.
Right. Yeah, I understand the idea. There's limited real estate on anybody's homepage, and that we have to always be concerned about the competing interests.
If I may, I think there's a link to committees, or you have to follow a link to get to the committees, and then you get a page with a list of the committees, some of which have links to more information, some of which don't. The Committee on the Environment you can go to, but there are no minutes. There's really not. So it varies depending on the committee, and some of them might have more information, some don't have much. So that's something I think, as far as invigorating the committee process, it would be helpful to just have more basic information about all of these committees, including archives of minutes and any other actions they've taken.
No, I would agree with you, and that's very helpful. And actually, we've been talking about that, about trying to put more clarity and uniformity on sort of things like the reporting requirements the committees have and the information. But I don't have a problem with asking people to go through the link to the committees for information on the Noise Control Board. But if somebody, what I thought you were suggesting is that if somebody, say their next door neighbor had a barking dog and they just wanted to know what they could do about it, that rather than calling the police, which you, I think correctly, believe people are kind of reluctant to do, that they could go to the city's website and they would say something about noise problems or noise concerns, and they could just click on that link and it would say, the city's ordinance provides X and you can file an informal complaint here.
Right, exactly that, Mayor Porter, yeah. I think it would be a great service to the community.
And I think it would be good information also.
Yes. I just wanted to add that I think these are all great ideas, and I think the first one that we can do is make an appointment next week.
Or
With
Stephen,
Steve on the-
yes, okay. We certainly can do
Mike
that. The easy one to fix.
And then they're up to 5.
We actually are going to be making some changes in the legislation surrounding the committees. And as far as I know, maybe I shouldn't say that because you all actually have a sort of an adjugatory function, so you might actually have a problem with being below full strength, but I don't think most of the committees do. I don't think, we'll check that out. But what I'm saying is I think we can change it, but it may not be something, we may go ahead and change it when we change the committee stuff rather than just for you all.
Okay.
Rather than going back and doing it again. But this is more dependent on, you know, how many times staff's willing to go through the process. Is there anything else? If we go ahead and implement these issues and sort of strengthen your public information capacity and modify the numbers of people, with Steve there, I believe you've got 5 people.
Yes.
Do you feel as if that would make you a fully functioning committee? Would you be comfortable with that situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really do. Mayor Port, and as long as, I mean, I don't want to speak for her, but I thought, but Jesse too had offered to provide us with whatever, some type of committee support,
Right.
administrative support. So I don't think we need a lot of it, but at least if she were my contact person, she's been very helpful. Now that she's connected to us, then that would enable us to get some of these things done.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's how it's going to work, or if it'll be, you know, if there will be a designated person who will be the administrative support for the committee, or...
The way most of the committees work is they have a staff contact person, and that person is generally appointed or selected or whatever by the city manager. And so in this case, I think that the city manager would be in the best position to sort of decide who would be the person with the appropriate knowledge and the time to be your contact person.
I think Rudy Rice has traditionally attended your meetings and given his involvement in noise issues. I would see that continuing. I know Jessie has expressed a strong interest in trying to work with you, as you indicated. She concurs that it wouldn't take a lot of time, and she would like to be of whatever assistance she can in helping you get reinvigorated. So,
Great.
But there's also no problem with them asking for another staff member to attend, such as Chief Corsi.
no, that would be fine as well.
It does seem like better coordination between the noise issues that the police department deals with and the noise issues that you all could deal with would be an important improvement to what both of you are able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree with that. Is there basic concurrence on the council to proceed with the suggestions that the board's made? I'm seeing concurrence. I think that would be very helpful.
I would like to get some feedback on Alert Tacoma, because I really think that's, it's ridiculous to have 2 sets of software to do the same thing. We should have one that works.
Well, I would agree that. I don't know.
I wrote down your concern, Councilmember Siemens, and put a star by it, which is my indication to follow up with Abel tomorrow.
Thank you.
And there is some history to this, that it's been up and working a number of times only to subsequently fail. So there's a fairly high hurdle of
Frustration.
well, I was going to say, I'm blanking on the word now, but it has to really prove itself more than things that have not had such a troubled history. So, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your coming to us with such well thought out suggestions. You've obviously done some good work on this, and it seems like these would all make a big difference in the kind of public education that gets out there and improving sort of noise issues within the community. So I thank you for the work that you've put into it. And we will go ahead and put your appointment on. I mean, we've done the interview. I don't think there's any concerns. I think it was just a question of, you know.
Would it continue?
With
With the noise?
Well, perhaps would it continue, but also, you know, if we subsequently change what it was doing, would you still be interested? Like, it would be another thing. Be very bad to be appointed to a committee and decide, wait a minute.
That's true.
But we appreciate your participation in this.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
I know this is a little earlier than we normally do, but I wanted for us to take a short recess and then come back to deal with our rent stabilization discussion, because I anticipate that's going to be a fairly long discussion this evening. So we will be back in just a few minutes. very large item we have on our work session this evening is a discussion of several proposals that Dr. Ken Barr has made in terms of rent stabilization. We're very glad to have you here. And I look forward to a very fruitful discussion. I want to say at the beginning of the discussion that I'd like to keep the discussion this evening on the proposal that we have in front of us. I know that there have been suggestions that we ought to sort of talk more generally about rent stabilization, but Dr. Barr is here this evening as part of his contract, and this is the only time we've contracted him to come, and I believe that's true, contracted him to come, or is there 2 times?
2 times.
Okay. Well, this is one of only 2 times. Well, yes, I think we figured that one out afterwards. But if he says 2, I'm going to take him up on it. And I'd like to use the time while we've got him here to talk about his proposal. I'd like to start with, if you could, we have people who will be watching this from home on the cable station. And so I'd like to start off, even though I'm assuming the council members have read the materials you sent us, if you could just start with a very, very super brief overview of what you gave us, just so people who are watching it at home sort of start with the same base of knowledge that we are, and then get into this into a little bit more detail and have some back and forth with the council. Does that make a certain amount of sense? I don't know if you have something you'd like to say to introduce this.
Along those same lines, in terms of just giving some background on Mr. Barr, as far as for people who may not be familiar with it, as the mayor has indicated, the city's entered into a contract with Dr. Barr in October, and his responsibilities are to review the current ordinance, to evaluate and to make recommendations on how it might address some of the concerns and issues that have been raised over the last 3 years. And then following this evening's discussion, depending upon the outcome of the public hearing, to draft legislation that would allow us to enact a revised or modified rent stabilization ordinance. He has a fairly extensive background in rent stabilization and rent control, serving as a consultant to a variety of California cities that are in drafting their rent regulations. He also has served as an expert witness for a number of cities in various fair return cases, which would fall into our economic hardship petition rent increase process. And if you Google him, you will find several articles on rent controls that have been cited extensively in New Jersey, California Supreme Court. And with that, Dr. Barr.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. First, I'll just start by giving my perspective on how I look at these issues. I feel rent regulations are in effect because the normal supply and demand pricing mechanisms don't work for rental housing, and therefore regulation can be necessary. And I think the purpose of the regulation is to provide a reasonable result. And I feel that a reasonable result is rent increases that cover operating cost increases and provide some growth in net operating income. And when I say net operating income, I mean the income after expenses but before debt service. And so the net operating income covers the mortgage payments, and it provides the cash flow, which of course varies between properties depending on what size mortgages they have. I feel that these objectives should be achieved without having to resort extensively to the petition process, and the petition process should basically be for exceptional cases. So basically you're creating what you could call like a surrogate for the market of saying, here are reasonable rent increases that people get automatically rather than getting market rent increases. And I also feel it's important that the standards in rent regulation, to the extent possible, that there be objective and not subject to manipulation. As I see the situation in Tacoma Park, and one way it's hard to talk about it because you know it 10 times better than I do, is that you have one set of owners who have just been getting the 70% of CPI increases, which I think is probably the majority of the units in the city. And I don't think that in light of cost increases and utility cost increases, I don't think that's been enough to provide much growth in net operating income for owners, and in some cases might not be providing any growth in net operating income at all. And I say this especially, it's likely to be true in cases of owners paying for heat as well as providing the other services. Then I feel you have another group of owners, which is a substantial portion of the units, but I think less than half, that have been getting capital improvement increases as well as the 70% of CPI adjustment. And the capital improvements are broadly defined. They really cover what you'd call as replacements and normal expenses that are incurred in the course of owning a building. For example, painting, new roofs, whatever. And let's say if you had a theoretical market which was balanced, in that theoretical market, apartment owners might be getting full CPI increases, but they wouldn't be getting capital improvement pass-throughs on top of that because the market wouldn't permit that, which is true in major portions of the country where there's plenty of land and the density isn't as high. And so I feel those owners are getting some of them are getting very substantial increases without any consideration of their overall profit, because you're just looking at their capital replacements and giving them an increase for that as well as for a portion of CPI. Okay. What I've done is, and I'll just go through them briefly, is made a series of specific recommendations. One is that I think at this point you have limited the rent increases to 70% of the CPI for about 14 years. And so I think the real cost of housing relative to prices has been reduced for the units that haven't gotten the capital replacement increases. And so I think one appropriate step would be to allow 100% of CPI increases now. Another step is I think that there should be a study of utility cost increases, and it might sound a little complicated, but I don't think it's that complicated, would be to require apartment owners to provide some number of years of utility bills. And I don't think that's a hard task because owners have to keep the expenses for tax purposes and generally do. You might not get 100% reply, but I think most owners would have this. And also the utility companies will provide certain number of back years of utility expense information to owners. I don't know how many years back, but I feel like this information, I mean, you might collect a lot of data, but it's not asking people to do something complicated. And I think that would put you in a reality, because now there's a lot of discussion about utility increases, but nobody knows what the ratios are to rental income, et cetera. And it's all analyzing the data and looking at the rates might be complicated because the rates go up and down as opposed to being level and figuring out what type of increases. But at least I feel you should be operating in reality when fashioning some policy for utility, and then if it's appropriate, adopt some kind of utility cost pass-throughs. Another proposal is I think that you should repeal the capital replacement pass-through, because I see that as a form of double counting, and instead cost for capital replacements should be considered in what you call the hardship petition if an owner wants to file that, because then you're comparing the growth in income with the growth in cost rather than looking at one and not the other. We call those fair return rather than the hardship, but that's just a question of terminology. Another suggestion I've made is, and this is clearly, these are all policy issues, is possibly to allow some kind of limited increase on vacancies, and I mentioned the numbers, either a 5 or 10% increase on vacancies, and the frequency of that increase should be limited. For example, not more than once every 5 years, because if you do have that kind of policy, you don't want a situation where an apartment owner has a big incentive to get somebody out, because then they can get a short-term, 3 short-term tenants in a row and get the rent increase substantially. But I feel like this small vacancy increase would be appropriate because of the to 70% of the CPI for so many years. And you might also have a limitation on these type of increases for owners who have gotten substantial capital improvement increases. And you also might possibly have slightly different vacancy increases depending on whether an owner pays for certain utilities. And it's my guess that the owners who pay for heat have gotten the biggest cost increase. But I'm not sure of that. And these are 4 separate items: the annual rent increase, or 3, the repeal of the capital replacement pass-through, and the limited increases on vacancies. But I'd say they're a package, so I'd say it wouldn't make sense, for example, if you just did increase the annual rent increases, adopted the limited increases on vacancies, but then kept the capital replacement increase, because I feel these 2 types of policies, which would lead to some increase in rents, should also be, the other policy should be adjusted too. So really, to try to get a system where people get rent increases, but not excessive rent increases, but rent increases that are reasonable sort of automatically, so they don't have to go through an administrative process. The next recommendation is that you have a uniform allowance for any expenses that you amortize. And if capital replacement pass-through is repealed, those costs would be considered within a fair return or hardship petition, but they'd be an amortized expense, because you wouldn't want somebody to be allowed to expense this all in 1 year, because it would lead to a huge rent increase. Under your current system, you look at the owner's actual financing. I don't think that's an appropriate policy, because if 2 owners do the same kind of incur the same kind of expense with the same cost, one owner shouldn't get a larger rent increase because they have less favorable financing. And I also think this can lead to a lot of manipulation, where someone can get less favorable financing, get their rent increase, and then get more favorable financing, and I'm sure you won't know about it. And also, it's somewhat, I think arbitrary. Why should one owner get more because they can't get as favorable financing? Also, in your fair return standard, you have something which I haven't seen before, where if an owner never had a mortgage, they get a net operating income adjustment at 100% of the CPI increase since the base year, where if they've ever had a mortgage, they only get 50% of the CPI increase since the base year. And I think that should be uniform among all owners, rather than dependent on their financing. And on top of this being a policy question, there's a lot of, as I point out in my report, there's a lot of judicial precedent for the conclusion that discrimination or variances in allowable rents, depending on an owner's particular financing, don't have a rational basis. And this is from New Jersey and California courts. And so, of course, it's not binding here, but other courts might, reach the same conclusion here. And so, basically, I see you having a kind of system where you have, certain adjustments that are almost automatic, and you have a fair return standard which allows a certain growth in net operating income, and then whatever financing issues and whatever investment the apartment owners makes, that's up to them. You're allowing a certain growth in income stream, and if they invest too much or too little or get good or bad financing, that's their business, not yours. You're regulating the rents, and rather than the profits in a way. But they have to, consider that regulation, and you have to formulate that regulation in a way that can't be manipulated. Another recommendation I made was that you adopt some kind of registration fee, because what I looked at was I saw that in the city budget only 1% of it is for the rent stabilization program, And I see it as a major policy program in the city that affects half the population, and it plays a large role in the lives of half the city. So I'd say either adopt some kind of registration fee to help fund it, or decide that a bigger part of the city budget should be used to cover this, or maybe both. But what's happened is rent control has sort of had a lower legitimacy on the scale of public expenditures, sort of historic bias against price regulation, and so this is common in cities, and cities in California have addressed this through the registration fee, but I'm not saying that's the only way to go. But I think just something so you have enough funds so you can, have good monitoring of the program, good policy analysis, good data, et cetera. And also if you do adopt some kind of utility cost pass-through, that's going to require more monitoring. And if you have some kind of vacancy increase, it is going to require also more monitoring. Another recommendation, and I didn't discuss this extensively, was now your exemption provides that if somebody owns just one unit, it's exempt from the ordinance. But if they own 2 or more units, then they're covered by the ordinance. And I saw that that's something that could be, completely manipulated, because if you own 2 units, you can just change the title on one of the units to somebody else. So I think the exemptions should be based on the physical characteristics of the property rather than the ownership. And I'm not talking about nonprofit ownership, that's a different issue, but I'm talking about, for-profit ownership. And some persons who read this were wondering, well, what about small owner-occupied buildings? But I think that's a different issue. Some cities do exempt small owner-occupied buildings, but if you do that, and I don't discuss this in the report, you want to do it in a way that's not manipulated, where somebody moves in for 6 months to get their building out from rent control and then moves out again. And there was a joke in Los Angeles that they had an owner-occupied or an exemption for relative occupied units, and they joked that after the rent control was adopted, the highways were crowded with relatives of landlords moving to LA. Okay. Another issue, and this is complicated, is under your system, if somebody doesn't take the rent increase they're not allowed to get that rent increase until the tenant moves out. And I don't know how that's working in practice here, but what I would imagine is that some owners are saying, well, look, I would like to not raise the rent for this tenant this year, but the problem is if I don't raise it this year, I can't raise it till they move out. And then for some units, you're producing a substantial gap between the rent they're charging and the rent that they could charge if there was a new tenant. So that leads to incentive to get the tenant out one way or another. So one suggestion was that you allow owners to take unused rent increases rather than waiting till the tenant leaves. But let me say there is a problem, or some drawbacks to that approach, because you don't want a situation where some tenants are getting a big rent increase because there are a lot of unused rent increases. And I also think it's complicated because maybe the unused rent increases are due to capital replacement increases, and that should be taken into account. So I threw out the general issue, but I think it needs to be looked into very carefully if you make a change, and be fashioned very carefully. Another recommendation, suggestion is that you have a few different alternate base years under your hardship standard. I suggested that also an owner be allowed to use the year 2000 in case they can't supply expenses back to 1990 or even earlier. And I also, one thing that might happen is if you don't have the capital replacement pass-through, some you might have more hardship petitions, or I think there's a good likelihood, because I think that a fair number of owners might be getting less than what your fair return standard or hardship standard defines as a fair return, but they haven't been using that route because the capital replacement process was in effect. So more owners would obviously shift to the hardship standard, except I'll qualify this, it might be that the owners who are likely to use the hardship standard have already used the capital replacement standard. But I was surprised you hadn't gotten more hardship increase applications. But I'd also say, as I said, the owners who have gotten capital replacement increases are probably getting a fair return, or at least a way, a long ways towards a fair return, of course, depending on the size of their increases. The other requirement I would suggest is that you require disclosure to apartment purchasers, because what I kept on hearing over and over is people bought properties without knowing what the rules are, and which is a crazy situation. And I think there should be requirements on what sellers have to do and what brokers have to do. So and if there's a lack of disclosure, there's a clear situation of liability. And I think after one lawsuit, everybody will start complying. So that's a brief summary of all the proposals and my suggestions.
Well, I appreciate the work that you did and the sort of the quality of the analysis and the recommendations you made to us. The council, in sort of initially addressing this situation, had said that our standards for revisions of the rent control ordinance would be that we wanted to make it simpler and fairer and more cost-effective. And I think that your recommendations have really incorporated a lot of that, so I very much appreciate it. Any comments or questions? Joy?
I have a couple of specific questions. One is on the exemption based on number of units owned. You said that should be based on the character of the property. Can you give me some idea how that would be translated into numbers? Because I've had a landlord let me know about our petition process and how difficult it is for someone with a building like his with 8 units to kind of carry through on that very labor-intensive process. 8 units might not be what you had in mind when you said exemption based on number of units.
Well, okay, I'd say more my recommendation was not, what it should be the exemption, is more that it shouldn't be based on the number of units owned, because that could be manipulated. Mm-hmm. And I think, as far as I see it, I don't think there's a, right or, wrong answer. In California, single unit properties are exempt. For example, either condominiums or houses, single-family dwellings. But I'm not saying that. Some cities exempted all buildings of 2 units or less, some 3 units or less, some 3 units or less that were owner-occupied. And I don't want to say to you that, this is a better result than that. I just see those as policy issues, as opposed to, let's say, some of these other things. I think there was a specific logical way of doing it. For example, taking out the financing cost and imputing a uniform cost for everybody. Well, this I don't think is a right or wrong. And I don't feel I know the community, well enough to answer that. And I don't know whether the single-family rentals are typically long-term rentals or temporary rentals, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that doesn't, that's...
No, that's helpful. It does sound like, though, that you could have a high-rise building that's all rental under rent control, or a high-rise building that's all condo, not under rent control.
That's one possibility. I'm not saying you should do that, but that's...
presumably one way to address that would have no exemptions based on the size of the property.
Yes, no, you could do that.
Okay, I have one other hearing.
Thank you, Mayor Porter, and thank you for this report. I think it's obvious in a short amount of time you've focused in on several issues with rent stabilization and provided information for us to take a look at, and I appreciate that. I'm especially concerned about our housing market here in Tacoma Park. In my neighborhood, we have, excuse me, we have roughly 1,200 units, rental units, and in the past year, about 45% of them have been affected in some way by changes in our housing market, either with units going to condominiums or two of the major properties that have applied for hardship increases. We also have one building that's been vacated and another building that's been exempted from the rent control or rent stabilization law, nonprofit building. So this is of particular importance to me. As I read through this, and excuse me if I poke a little fun at you, but it sounds like a typical consultant report, because the bottom line I hear is that we need to do more studying, that this is not just a menu that we can go down and pick, or it isn't something that we can just take in its entirety and change it into modifications to our ordinance. You suggested some of these that need additional information that we should put together before actually enacting them in legislation, or before we can decide whether we want to. And I also think I heard you say that you weren't suggesting that this was something that we enact in total, but that these were basically a menu of things that we could consider.
Right, except as I said, some of them I think are interrelated. Yeah, and hopefully I felt it was a simple research menu.
No, I think it's very helpful. I appreciate that, and like I said, I did poke a little bit of fun at it. But
no, fair enough.
But I think it's important for the community to know that they're not coming in for a public hearing to do a thumbs up and thumbs down on a proposal, but that there's these are good discussion points at this point. And is that the way you see this report?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
As I said, oh, I'm sorry, Bruce, and then I've got a few comments.
Just a couple of questions for follow-up on some of your points. The first one, and this may be more a question for Sarah than for you, in your information under the background with the rent adjustments under the ordinance and the history of the rent increases, I noticed that there was one gap in the table, and I didn't know whether that's because there is a gap or because whether the data is missing. There's the August 83 to September 85, and then it jumps to October 86 to June of 90, and everything else follows where it's, year to year, or do we have a gap in the data there?
There's not a gap in the data. It's just when the calculations were done and the annual adjustment was adopted.
So there was no annual rent increase at all for the period September 85 to October 86?
Oh.
It might have just been a mistake.
It could be just a typo.
Oh. Pardon? All 4%?
My computer made a mistake.
Oh, okay. So it should have been October 85 to June 90?
I imagine.
Okay.
When I say my computer, I made a mistake.
But basically, the differences in the months, at least, have more to do with when the actual amount
the months I understand, but there's that 1 year gap.
I didn't notice that. That's very good.
And it was interesting to see the difference that it made once the 70% of the CPI was adopted. And I know some of that probably has to do with the where prices were going in that first part, when the kind of the reason for rent control came about, because rents were going up so fast, where you start out with that 10% limit, and then it kind of falls back to the 4%, 5%, and then all of a sudden to the 70%, you're down with much lower figures of 1 and mostly 1 and 2%. Because when you go through and look at the end result of those, when you start with September of '81 to the present, the overall increase for the whole period is 72.2%. And I know that in your data you say that once the 70% starts, it's 31.3% for that 14-year period. And I just kind of looked to see what rents would have done, and I picked a arbitrary and what I thought might be typical figure of a starting rent of $500 for a unit in September of '81, and what that means it would be today, and it means it would be $861 today, and almost half of that came about in the first period of time before the 70% of CPI. I just thought it was interesting to look at thinking about if you had a $500 rent, what it would be today, and comparing that increase to the increase for everything else that we've experienced in September of '81, and thinking, as you pointed out, that in many cases the rents, basically yes, there was certainly rent control, and those rents stayed much lower than everything else. The cost of rents didn't rise as fast, and kind of put another way, the tenants got a really good deal. And I'm just going through because I made a couple of notes here. When in your discussion of the mobile home park owners in the court case, you talk about indefinitely freezing and the 100% indexing not constitutionally required, and the court explains that the use of indexing may satisfy the fair return criterion because park owners typically derive a return on their investment not only from the income the park produces, but also from an increase in the property's value or equity over time. And what struck me was that the property's value, the increase in the property's value over time is pegged to the income that the property generates. Therefore, the less income it generates, the less the property value goes up. Therefore, the influence of rent control can suppress all pieces of the value over time. And I thought that it was interesting that that pointed that out, but it didn't quite make it clear. And then in the increase upon vacancy, could you just go back over it again and talk a little bit more about with vacancy decontrol, how that might, kind of the positives and the negatives of either full vacancy decontrol or partial decontrol. You talked a little bit about, maybe limiting it to so often or a certain percentage. And I want to have a little bit better understanding in my own mind about vacancy decontrol. So just expand your explanation so that my understanding can be a little bit broader.
Okay. Well, the full vacancy decontrol is, unlimited increases upon vacancy, and basically, if you want to keep an affordable housing stock,
over time, it all goes away.
Yeah, it would go to a market stock. Let's say half the units would become vacant in 5 years, whatever. And it would also, in the meantime, for units that are renting well below market, it would create a strong incentive to get the tenant out one way or another, either not doing the maintenance very well, possibly harassing the tenant, or possibly just giving some cash to the tenant, because if you can raise the rent $300 on a vacancy, giving a tenant $5,000 or $10,000 cash is a very good investment. And so the alternative is, let's say 5 or 10% increase, and I'm not saying you should do this forever. It's a policy you can adopt for a certain period, not continue it or have it continuously. is, it's a moderate increase. I don't think it's enough that it's going to lead apartment owners to try to get their tenants out, because there's some cost even of having turnover, and plus the gain is not that great. And as far as what numbers those should be, I see that as a policy issue. I'm not saying 5 and 10 are round numbers. And so I don't know what, more to say about that, but that I see as a, sort of a small increase, and you have kept the rents below the CPI increases for 14 years.
So is there more of a reason to use that as a correction mechanism, or as a piece of a larger attempt to address everything holistically?
I would see it, I thought of it in this case as a type of correction mechanism, because my suspicion is that, especially because of the utility increases, that for a lot of owners their net operating income hasn't grown in years, but I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in your discussion on the capital improvement pass-through, you say most of the U.S. market conditions usually limit rent increases to the rate of increase in the CPI, and apartment owners need to cover capital replacement costs within this framework. I guess I don't quite understand why just a purely market system would limit rent increases to the CPI.
Well, because there's enough increase in the supply, and you never have a purely market system, because it takes a while to build housing and all that. But there are parts of the country where land is cheap and it's in plentiful supply. And when I say in plentiful supply, you're 10 miles outside of the urban center, 15 miles outside of the urban center, and the land is there. And the restrictions are very small on buildings, so apartments can go up very easily, and that's more of a market system. Mm-hmm. And actually in the places where there's hardly any regulation at all, have had even lower rent increases, because there's often been overbuilding, for example, Texas or Arizona. And so, it's interesting, these people talk about rent control being restrictive on the market, but rent control is in conjunction with usually areas where there's very strong restrictions on the supply because of building regulations, density regulations, etc. And they're big metropolitan areas, so you can't go out any farther. So I guess what I'm saying is, full CPI would be let's say, quote, a fair market, and in large parts of the country, that's what owners are getting, or even less.
But in a densely populated urban area like this, in many ways, the CPI and the rates are decoupled.
Right. And because, the density restrictions, we're so used to them that we don't think they're strong, but the density restrictions are incredibly strong in this country. Right. And, if the density limits were doubled in the Washington area, you'd end the housing shortage pretty fast. And if you said that single-family homeowners could all put second units, that would be free market. But nobody really wants a free market.
We won't even go into the history of how things went in reverse here.
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that we've had some recent experience with proposed increases in density that got very negative responses. I have a few questions, and I'll go to Mark, but I have a few questions in terms of things that, since Bruce is starting to go through it in some detail, I'll go ahead and do that.
Well, I did it as a way of getting a little broader sense.
Okay. But there's several sort of overall things that, first of all, I thought that I really liked your analysis, because, as I said earlier, I thought you really sort of worked with our principles of simplicity and cost effectiveness and those kinds of things. And the system that you propose in your first recommendations of essentially a system that provides bigger automatic annual increases, but on the other side eliminates capital, you call them capital replacement, which is actually probably more accurate than capital improvement, eliminates capital improvements petitions, but it makes the overall annual return larger, is probably, for many places, would probably result in about the same thing, but the increases would be more fair across the system because you would no longer have the sort of experienced larger property owners getting the sort of the bulk of the increases, which is what your analysis basically shows at this point. So there is, I think, some argument for doing that. And one of the things that I couldn't quite figure out in thinking about this, I wasn't around when rent stabilization began, so I'm not sure sort of what the rationale was at the beginning. But I think what it does right now is not so much try and suppress the market as it tries to maintain affordable housing by preventing gentrification. In other words, it's set up so that or it's supposed to be set up so that it enables a property owner to maintain their property at, a basic decent level, but it discourages people from improving their property to luxury status where they can charge very high rents for it. And so the question that I would have is the system just taking that piece of it, sort of the eliminating capital improvements, but allowing larger sort of annual increases and taking into account things like utilities that go up faster than the overall CPI and that are a proportionally larger part of housing expenses than they are of some other things. The question that I have is, what would you see this type of a system as having the same disincentives for gentrification and the loss of affordable housing?
Well, I think if, I think it would reduce the, gentrification a little bit in the sense that owners wouldn't feel squeezed. They could feel like they could get a reasonable profit out of their buildings without going the petition process. But I'd also say this, the qualification is the market's forces are so strong and the values keep on going up of condominiums. I understand you're in a flat period now. At some point they can just overwhelm no matter what you have, but it's sort of a trade-off, and the tighter you make it, the more you increase the gentrification possibly because people go to condominium conversion. But I can't measure the degree of the cause and effect there.
But I guess there's not a reason to think that the annual cost increases, larger annual cost increases coupled with elimination of capital improvement petitions would act as a larger incentive for people to, say, take a building. I mean, the condominium conversions are something that happens for reasons within the community and primarily outside the community. Right now the condominium conversions just don't seem to be happening. I know people still talk about them, but the information that we have is that they've largely stopped and some of the conversions that were in process have turned around. But I agree with you. I don't think that's a situation that will last forever. But the question is, if one of the alternatives is to, say, take a building which is affordable and rehabilitate it or turn it into a luxury unit, eliminate some of the small units and make, huge penthouse type things and put in very fancy things and then charge very large rents for it. One of the ways that I think our system currently works is that you could potentially get back the cost of some basic improvements, but not the high-end improvements. Right. And you couldn't increase your profit, essentially, by doing that. Nobody wants to run a luxury building for the same profit margin as you would run a affordable unit. So that sort of discourages people from doing that. But if we hook the overall rents to a CPI, a full CPI, then at some point do you get into a situation where it becomes profitable to do that? Or isn't there a reason to think that you would? I haven't been able to figure that. I've sort of been trying to think this through and haven't gotten quite there yet.
Well, it doesn't become more profitable to, do expensive capital improvements.
Mm-hmm.
And not sure, I mean, I guess I just see it as more...
But you would be upping your expenses. See, if and maybe this is, I think what you're saying is that there's not necessarily a bias in the system one way or the other, if I'm understanding you correctly. Is that what you're saying? Because I can think of it going in both directions. On the one hand, you could have, if you did very expensive improvements, presumably your operating costs would also go up.
Well, okay, first of all, the improvement expenses would be amortized, and you'd have to show that you're not getting a fair return.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, I mean, within your fair return standard, you could say that certain kinds of expenses, can be counted, and other kinds that are not necessary won't be counted. I mean, that's a policy issue. And
we have that in the current one.
right. And so, or you have that certain kind, let's say new services or luxuries, you have to get 50% tenant consent. We have that in a lot of mainly in the mobile home park ordinances.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last one.
Mainly in the ordinances that regulate the rents of mobile home parks.
Yeah, mobile home parks, yeah.
We have 100 cities in California that regulate the rents of mobile home parks.
Okay, now that's helpful. I don't want to beat this idea to death, but that is a useful thing to think about, that maybe there should be some sort of exemptions from that. The next thing was sort of, one of the things that we've talked about is we've talked about going to 100%, but going to 100% of like a rental CPI. Does that make more sense than the overall CPI?
Well, the rental CPI reflects the shortage. And basically the theory of the rent regulation is you're supposed to base it on the overall cost.
The cost, right.
The main thing is, I'd say, whatever CPI you have, stick with it, because I see people, cities, there's pressure to one CPI is good one year, everybody wants that year, then another CPI is good another year, and
I see what you're saying, and you're saying that the rental cost CPI actually reflects the upward effect of the shortages, and so if we use that, we're essentially sort of getting into a circular argument there.
Right.
Okay, got that. Bruce started talking about some of the issues about the vacancy decontrol. The other thing that you mention is that if we did vacancy decontrol, we could choose to deny increases in which the vacancy resulted from reduction in maintenance or harassment, or presumably, which is unfortunately at this point legal, as retaliatory evictions. And one of the things that it sounds to me that we could do would be if we decided to go with a limited vacancy decontrol, we could use it as a disincentive to retaliatory evictions. I still think we should address the law, but it sounds like this is something that could be used for that purpose. Am I correct about that?
Well, let me see if I understand. You're saying because if it's limited, it won't be an incentive to manipulate or to harass.
No, actually what I'm saying is sort of the opposite, that if we had the ability to deny vacancy decontrol increases, then we could use that as a disincentive for property owners to evict tenants because, for example, they complained about the condition of their units or something.
Yes.
Question about the issue of the unused rent increases. You mentioned that we've talked about this back and forth, and during the time I've been on the council, we've had it actually both ways. And I remember one of the reasons we did it the way we did is because of the concern that you mentioned that it could result in a fairly large rent increase at a particular time. If we went the other direction again, But we limited the percent increase. For example, if you had built up a number of rent increases that you hadn't taken, that you could take the increases at any point, not just on a vacancy, but we limited the percent increase that could happen at one time to some number, some X percent.
Right.
Does that create a problem? I mean, to some extent, there would still be a disincentive to, not issue the rent increases, but I think it would be less if you allowed people to do it up to a limit.
I think that would make sense. One thing that would be helpful, it wasn't done in the time I had for preparing, but is to get some reports showing what the gaps were in the city. How many are $10 under the legal rent ceiling, how many are 50,
Right.
et cetera.
See if my recollection when we did that, we had a report like that, and if I remember, there were a lot of rents at that time, and that was some years ago, that were below the limit, but there were not a lot that were way below the limit. Am I right?
They were way below the limit. It was 40 or 50% of the units were substantially below what they could have gotten. I remember looking at some of the buildings, and you were talking $70 to $100 a month,
Right.
which just struck us all kind of strange that people were complaining about it but weren't taking the increases.
Right. We had talked about this earlier, and I'd gone through and just done some quick and dirty math, and based on we had broken it out by the different sizes of the units. If you recall, we had efficiencies all the way up to 3 bedrooms to 4 bedrooms. And the average, which again doesn't reflect the range, of the difference between the actual rents being charged and the maximum allowable rents was about 10%. So some, were at $2, others were $100. But on average, there was about a 10% difference between the two numbers. I can't tell you off the top of my head how many units were impacted by this, but that was the last rent report that we ran from last year's calculations.
Okay.
But we can get you that information.
Okay. Thank you.
A couple of questions. First, I thought this was really well done, and I recognize it's a menu, but I thought to me it made sense as a package because it seemed to address a pretty wide range of concerns that people had, and it makes more sense to address that. At least in my opinion, I felt like it made more sense to address the breadth of concerns than to try to pick and choose a couple of these things and not do them all. I think they make sense collectively. The one thing I didn't understand and had a hard time understanding is the unused rent increase logic, because if the landlord's not giving a rent increase to somebody, why are they going to be incentivized to get rid of that person? I mean, they're voluntarily not giving them a rent increase. If they wanted to get rid of them, they could have simply given them the permitted rent increases if they thought that was going to take them out of the building.
Okay. Well, I imagine that, let's say there's been change in the market situation. Let's say when they didn't give the rent increase, they gave it,
because of the market rather than
right,
because they're being nice.
And
I see the difference. I mean, one would be, that's a nice little old lady living there, and I want to up her rent. The other is, there's no point in my upping my rent because the market right now is soft. And I could go there, but I wouldn't be able to get anybody to rent because there are other places they could go, so I'm not going to take the rent. But now if the market tightens up again,
right,
then there's a reason for me to take that rent increase.
Right, and try to get the tenant out. Or let's say that somebody's being nice to a particular tenant because there's unlimited income, and then you have a change in owners, and the new owner wants to get the person out.
Okay, that helps.
The new owners.
I like your use of fair return rather than the capital improvement petition, and I think that makes sense. I mean, I think it needs to be defensible, and I think you talked about why it's defensible, and that's sort of what we were trying to get with the hardship petition.
Right.
I also think we know that a lot of things were being done in the capital improvement petition that had no business being in the capital improvement petition. The people in their annual taxes were taking them and treating them as expenses, which is what you'd want to do because it would knock down your income by taking it as an expense much faster than by taking it as a capital improvement. So I can see the logic for getting rid of that and treating things as fair return issues rather than as capital improvement issues. I want to reiterate the vacancy decontrol point, because I think that we would very rapidly have no reason to have rent control if you had vacancy decontrol in the city, and you would go to rent to market rents, and affordable housing would be pretty much gone. And I want to put a context on that, because this afternoon the county council met with Royce Hanson, and Hanson was talking about the housing thing, and one of the things he said this council, the county council, is going to have to address is affordable housing. And he said the county is going to produce in the next 25 years, if it produces 75,000 units, it's going to produce 5,000 affordable units under county programs. 5,000 affordable units in 25 years. So there's nothing that the county is doing that's going to provide any offset for any loss of units, either through rent increases or through condo conversions. And so his direction to the council was that they are going to be looking at ways and encouraging the council to focus on preservation of existing affordable housing, because no one's going to replace the existing affordable housing. And I'd add to that, in places like Silver Spring, tenants there are seeing rent increases between 10 and 25%. Not because the operating expenses of buildings have gone up, but because Silver Spring now has a certain cachet that it didn't have a little while ago, and you can get those rents in Silver Spring that you couldn't get before. And there's going to be a massive displacement of people who need affordable housing. And we're not talking about low-income people necessarily. We're talking about, lower middle class, working class people who aren't going to be able to afford $1,800 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in Silver Spring. And that's about where things are going now in Silver Spring. So I feel very strongly that the one thing, maybe the most important thing that this law did from its inception was focus on the preservation of affordable units rather than just on the protection of the tenants. Because if we'd focused on the protection of the tenants, all the housing at Tacoma Park by now would be high-income housing. There'd probably be maybe a couple of pockets that weren't, but you would have transformed the city to pretty much mostly white, upper-middle-class city if we had done that. And the people who could live in Montgomery County because of the housing we provide would have no place to live in this city, nor any place else in Montgomery County. So I think that's one thing that rent control has done, and done fairly well. I think your suggestions address some of the economic inequities. I'm not going to argue about the 100% of the CPI. And I think there's some merit to limiting the rent increases on vacancy. If we did it on every year, I think that'd be very problematic, but 5 to 10% every 5 years is not going to evaporate the housing in the city, certainly not in our lifetime. And presumably someone else is going to have to deal with this problem. I mean, this isn't just a housing problem, it's an employer problem. Mm-hmm. And one thing that does seem to be happening is the employers in the D.C. metro area seem to be waking up to the fact that the out-of-control housing market is leaving them with no employees, that people just cannot live anywhere close to where they work anymore. And a lot of the low-paid retail jobs that are so much of the county's economic revival, the people who work there don't have any place to live around here. So maybe we'll get lucky in the next 10 or 15 years and other parts of the private sector will realize this isn't just a housing issue, it's a broader social issue that's going to impact on the economic viability of this community. But I commend you for what you did. I don't find much to argue with in here, and I think it's pretty well balanced, and it was good work.
I have a couple of other specific questions, and I admit to not being an expert on this, but I do appreciate the thorough review you've given to our ordinance, and also that you've added some additional context about what other communities have done and how they've achieved certain goals. One of the questions that I had about the increases upon vacancies is, given that we've had the 70% of CPI for a number of years, how long would you think it would take for landlord to catch up? in terms of their, if they were at a deficit? Would it be, I'm assuming it would be dependent on the percentage of the
Right. Well,
the increase they could take upon vacancy, but
okay, if you say catch-up would be, let's say, get the difference between the 70, if they had gotten 100% of the CPI in the past instead of 70%, it seemed to me there was about a 15% difference in the allowable rent increases over the last 15 years. So in that case, I would see that, I don't know, it would take 15 years for any owner to get 3 5% increases, and that would be if they had turnover once every 5 years.
They still have the fair return mechanism.
Right, right. But, yeah, but the use of the fair return mechanism would go down as the rents from alternate mechanisms went up. Yeah. So I say 15, but
that would be 15 years. That would be 15 years if we changed it so that it was 100% of the CPI.
Right.
But what I'm asking is more about the vacancy decontrol issue and how you have limited increases upon vacancies.
Right.
So if you were trying to assist landlords who maybe had been operating at a deficit, what type of percentage would you think would accomplish that? Would it be a 30% cap on an increase upon?
Oh, okay. Well, no, okay. I was more suggesting 5 or 10%.
Well, what I saw is the D.C. ordinance, which I believe was changed just
Right.
recently, and they have a certain form of rent control, and it says that there's a 30% cap on the increase for a substantially identical unit in the same building.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I was suggesting much lower numbers. I mean, 5 or 10%, because I didn't want it to be an incentive.
Right.
To get tenants out. Plus, I wanted to suggest it just be a small, moderate increase, which will help, some.
Jerry, can I just say something about, you're talking about comparable unit in the same building, and that's different, because then you would have the situation of the tenant who was favored versus the tenant who wasn't favored, and that would be your likely 10% difference between somebody who was at the higher rent and somebody who was at the lower rent. That would be covered by the 10%. They're not doing 30% across the board. It's 30%, up to 30% for a comparable unit. That's different.
Okay. The other question I had is when you talked about the exemption for number of units owned, it seems that if you're basing it on physical characteristics, are you basing it on whether the location of the unit is in among owner-occupied housing versus the location of the unit being where there's a substantial majority of renter occupied?
No, I would say it's, for example, it could be, one-unit dwellings. It could be single-family only. It could be single-family or a condo. I'm not saying one's right or another, or it could be 2 units or 3 units. I mean, basically what I'm saying, it shouldn't be something based on the ownership in terms of whether somebody owns 1 unit, 2, 3, or 4, because that can just be manipulated. I mean, if you own 2 units, you can give 1 unit to your relative and then create an exemption for both of them, and that, that doesn't make sense because you're just moving paper around.
So how do you make this judgment? I'm still not
Which
getting a concrete
ones have
idea of
the
how we
exemptions
would do
for?
this.
Well, I just say it's based on some objective factor, and I'm not saying which one's right or wrong, but I'm saying base it on an objective factor, not one that's subject to manipulation through paper arrangements. Right,
and that's why I'm asking if it would make sense to base it on what the surrounding properties were. Like if you, as a landlord, owned one property and it was in among other rental property, that's a different physical characteristic at that time than if you...
Okay, I guess I wasn't thinking in those terms of what it was surrounded by, but more what that particular unit was.
Is it a single-family house or is it a condo unit?
Yeah, or is it a two-unit dwelling?
Well, and if it's a condo unit, is it a condo unit that's on, like in Ward 1, we have a very single-family residential feel, and then there's this one small building, I think it has on Tulip, the 12 units, something like that, and it went from rent-controlled units to now condos. Those condos are different than, say, the condos that are developing on Lee Avenue.
No, I wasn't thinking of varying it by the location in the city and the characteristics of the neighborhood.
Okay, you would say that wouldn't be a good way to vary it.
No. I've never heard of any city doing that.
Well, I'm not really suggesting it, so
Right,
if it's not something that's done, I'm simply trying to figure out what physical characteristics you could make this exemption.
Right, okay, I'd say that the characteristics of that particular unit rather than what surrounds it. That's right.
Whether it was an apartment-type unit or whether it was a house?
Well, that's a different characteristic in the particular unit, let's say whether it's a condo or whether it's a house. And you could have exemption for just one of those, just for houses, single-family dwellings, or you could have it for single-family dwellings and for condos. And there are arguments. The condos, I don't know what percentage of them are just held for investment as opposed to, owners going away for a year or two. So I'd say there are different policy issues in the two types of exemptions. No exemption system is perfect. There are pros and cons, but
okay.
Yeah, but not based on the neighborhood, or I don't think you should do that.
It's a follow-up to the point that I thought Joey was trying to get at a minute ago, if I can try it a different way. If we were looking at the 70% of CPI versus maybe if it should have been 100% of CPI, and we were looking at that accumulated deficit of what wasn't there that maybe should have been there, and we were looking for a mechanism to try to make that up, would it be that we were trying, it was vacancy decontrol, partial vacancy decontrol is the mechanism to make that up, or is it looking at the fair return that makes that up, or is there some other way of addressing that?
Well, both those ways serve to make it up, but I'd say the fair return is a constitutional right. And I sort of saw the vacancy, the limited vacancy increase as a way of making up.
And so I took it that her question was, and if we were thinking about what it was that we were trying to craft with the vacancy decontrol or partial vacancy decontrol that was a reasonable way of getting there, recognizing that you can't just say, oh, well, for X number of years it was such and such a percentage, so we'll just put that percentage in now to make that up, and then everybody's rent goes up, and that doesn't work. So you spread it over time. What percentage are we looking at? And I guess we could calculate it, but was your sense that it was probably about 15%?
Right, because my understanding is that during a period when the CPI went up 50%, the rents went up 35%. Except for the buildings that got capital replacement increases, which is a big group.
And so in trying to look at a partial vacancy decontrol, there are different ways of setting that up to try and get at that percentage.
Right.
And that's something we would have to, if we wanted to go that way, come up with the details. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Porter. I appreciate hearing Councilmember Elridge talking about the affordable housing crisis in Montgomery County and in the region, not just here in Tacoma Park. And I really applaud the fact that Councilmember Elridge is going to be on the county council to help to resolve those issues. And I say that seriously.
I look forward to you coming up and visiting.
We will be there. But, you know, when I said 45% of the residents or the families in this neighborhood have either faced or are facing threats to their homes or their rents over and above the regulated rent control amounts, this is a serious problem in this neighborhood, as it is across the county. And over the past several weeks, this council has talked about tweaking rent control or rent stabilization to try to make it more sustainable, to try to lessen the economic pressures on the landlords, and so that, you know, we don't have 45% of the families facing this hardship. But tweaking rent stabilization may not be the only answer, and I know you're the rent control expert from across the nation, but I wonder, you know, if you've addressed our ordinance here in your report, but I wonder if you had any suggestions for this council in looking at the broader picture of how to how we look at beyond just rent stabilization, how we look at really making sure improving our odds of having sustainable, affordable housing here in Tacoma Park. You know, specifically, I'm interested in this neighborhood. What can we do so that the people who live here in this community can continue to afford to live here in this community?
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that. Let me say that I don't know if this, because I'm coming from a system in one way, the rent control issues are comparable, but our whole system is so much different what I'm used to. For example, in California, the cities all regulate condominium conversions, and they can either prohibit them or allow them unlimited, but it's a city power. And also, in all the California rent... What?
That's what we need.
And also, all the California rent controls include eviction controls. So you have it's such a totally different situation here, it's hard to figure out. And what I'll just mention the city. I come from Berkeley with just adopted program. They allow 100 condominium units, not buildings, units a year to be converted. And instead of your 4% fee, there's a 12.5% fee on the sales price. So if any time a unit's sold in the condominium ownership, there'll be a $50,000 fee. And owners, it's well worth owners. They're applying to do this. But I don't know about the overall strategy. I just don't know enough.
Okay. Well, I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that the suggestions you've made aren't exactly tweaking the process. They're fairly fundamental realignment of the rent stabilization law. And I think, I mean, that's sort of what we were looking for. We were looking for somebody to take a look at this and say, does this make sense? I mean, or should we be setting it up differently? And so I think this is fairly fundamental.
Well, I didn't mean to minimize the contribution you're making to this. I just worry, though, that even with this, it's not going to be enough to safeguard the residents.
The market forces can overwhelm it. I mean, we have most cities in California, or let's say it's substantial cities that contain a substantial percentage of the rental units in the state, we're getting condominium conversions like crazy without rent control.
Montgomery County.
Yeah.
What?
Montgomery County.
Yeah, Montgomery County. So the market forces can overwhelm it.
I guess my question is: are there ways other than control to affect a good housing program for the community, for those members of the community that need the safeguards? Are there other approaches to solving that issue than rent control or other types of control?
improved educational and job opportunities.
What?
I don't-
He says improved educational and job opportunities.
Yeah.
At a living wage with guaranteed health benefits.
Jobs, housing balance.
I don't know if you could provide other incentives to owners in return for, providing some affordable housing. I just don't know what would work.
Government ownership of all housing units.
What?
Government ownership of all housing.
I mean, there's nobody who's cracked this nut. I mean, it's not like you've got a model you can look at and say, here's a city where they've got affordable housing for everybody who needs it, and they've got a balanced housing need. Nobody's done that.
Okay,
Just want to say my daughter's doing a report on Gene Autry, Oklahoma for her third grade class, and there is a place called Gene Autry, Oklahoma. There are 99 residents there, and I think 38 single-family homes. And the average price of housing there is about $20,000 to $30,000 a house, if you want to live there. Hi. I wasn't here when you came the first time because I got shipped down to New Orleans for the week for my job. But I actually hail from before Tacoma Park from Temescal in Oakland, right by Broadway and 51st, so probably not far from you. And what I would have told you then if I had met you then is I'm not a really big fan of rent control, although I'm a big fan of affordable housing, and mostly because it's such a cumbersome mechanism, which is sort of what we're trying to cope with here. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about with all of the pieces that you've offered and that I would like you to talk a little bit about is the potential impacts of these shifts on the people that we have in the housing now. So, for example, we might reset some of these rents through these various processes, but do you have some sense of what the overall impact? Have you gone through this with the city before, and have you studied or observed, even anecdotally, what happens to the folks that are in the housing as these shifts go through? Because I think, from my perspective, there's a lot of fear around just any movement. Because even though I'm not a fan of rent control, I also don't want to make changes that are going to that harm people.
Well, I think the impacts of this on the current residents would not be large. The annual adjustments would end up being about, let's say, 1% greater. In years you had 4% CPI increase.
Even with these fair return changes?
Okay. Well, the fair return changes, I'd say, is more variable. If the owners have a right to a fair return now. So the question is if more of them start petitioning for it.
Right.
So and that could happen because if you don't have the capital replacement pass through, except the sophisticated owners who would take the fair return petition, do the fair return petitions, have already done the capital replacement increases, some of them. So I'd say the new impact is the annual increases, and the proposed registration fee, if you adopted that.
That's a pass-through on top of the rent?
Yeah.
It's not absorbed, okay.
Right. It would be, as opposed to, let's say, the city covering that would be $6 a month.
So the renters then are basically paying for the program that sustains the affordability. Okay. I think some of the most important things that I've heard you say and things that I've been really concerned about is that we're regulating rents rather than profits, and I think that's right. And I think one of the things that we get bogged down in, and something that was mentioned earlier tonight, is we give somebody a capital improvement. Do they then turn around and take it on their taxes? And well, personally, I don't care about that because, to me, that's an issue about their personal income. And what I really care about is whether or not the rent is affordable. And so I would really like to get away from those kinds of questions in pretty much every element of the ordinance, so that we're not trying to deal with people's profit issues other than some basic issue of a fair return, and not get into their personal taxes or business taxes. But the other thing is that a fair return is a constitutional right. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that we're going to get sued, and that we're going to get sued for takings, or we're going to get sued for equal treatment. And so The other thing that you commented about is the arbitrariness of whether or not an owner had a mortgage of only 50% of the CPI as its base. And as many times as the mayor has tried to explain it to me, I can like grasp it for, you know, the 5 minutes that we're in conversation, and then it kind of floats out of my head, and I have to relearn it the next time we come back to it. So I can imagine it's probably difficult for other people as well. So I have some other questions. One of the things is about the utility issue, and you mentioned that you're worried about how the utility issue changes might create disincentives for landlords to provide energy efficiency. And I was wondering if you couldn't offer them a choice of the higher of either option, which would be, one would be their actual utility cost, or two would be a utility standard. I happen to work for HUD, and HUD uses, you know, a rental.
Utility allowance.
Yeah, they, and if you use the higher of either of those, they could recoup some savings for energy efficiency and pay for the difference basically out of. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, so if there was a standard rate for what it costs to have electric heating, but then they put in energy efficiency, and if it was actual cost, they wouldn't recoup any money for the investment that they spend on the green building or the energy efficient building. But if it was based on a standard for utilities that was set by an average, they could, and it could incentivize folks to do it, because a lot of those pay for themselves after a few years. I don't know if you'd ever considered that or not.
Well, okay, I guess I'd say, when I mentioned the two alternatives of an actual cost pass-through or a standard one, you know, for uniform, let's say, I mean, when I say uniform for the type of utility provided, let's say gas, but I feel that you should only do the actual cost pass-through if the variations are huge, because it's very burdensome, because it means everybody in the city ends up with a different size rent increase, and it's very hard to administer. And that one, I understand what you're saying, they'll have some incentive if they get the higher of the standard allowance or the cost pass-through, but I feel if they don't have the cost pass-through, then they even have a stronger incentive. If they only have one fixed amount that they can get no matter what. And I would only see, I strongly recommend that you get some uniformity among classes.
Right. That's a problem for us, though, because there's such variation in who's paying for utilities and who's
Well, I'm not talking,
not.
No, the variations depending on who's paying for it. Let's say type A building is the owner pays for gas, type B is the owner pays for gas, and like, you know, type B cost is electricity. So you have
So there'd be no utility allowance if the tenant pays for utilities?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's a given.
But I'm saying do it by class of service rather than this owner it costs $20 to supply the electricity. This owner, it costs $30, so we'll give $120 and $130. So there'd be some standard. I mean, there might be 6 different classes, but there
Has this been done other places in the country? Because I have to tell you, I've sat for 2 weeks and done rent reviews with HUD, and you have to check off what particular device they're using and what utility they're using, and there's a lot of different incarnations that you could have, and it could have huge variation. It seems complex, and I think one of the issues that the mayor pointed out earlier is that we're looking for much less complex.
But it would still be, from an administrative standpoint, it would still be less complex than going through everybody's utility allowance to determine what their actual costs were and what that would translate into for an allowable rent increase for that particular individual unit within that building.
Right. Yeah. And you know, I just bought my house 2 years ago, and I tried to get the previous utility use so I could compare my first year, and they wouldn't release it to me because I wasn't the owner that year. What's the most common unit exemption that you have? Now, I used to work in fair housing, and the exemption, you were exempt from most portions of the Fair Housing Act if you had 4 or more units. What's the most common exemption that you see in terms of defining your requirements under rent stabilization?
Okay, under city ordinances, I'd say it's been buildings that are owner-occupied in less than a certain number of units. For example, 3 units.
That are both or either or?
Either, any of the units in the building. Let's say 3 units or less, 2 units or less. Under city ordinances, we now have, I'm not suggesting this, we have the statewide exemption for any building that's in a unit that's in a single ownership, whether it's a condo or a house, if it's a singly deeded unit, it's exempt under state law.
So any single-family house or any condo would be exempt?
There's some limitations on the condo exemption, but they're very small.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Thank you. I had asked earlier about the ability to require disclosure in the real estate transaction when we were talking about how people were getting into trouble because they were purchasing units and they didn't realize that there was a law. And my understanding was that we don't have the ability to make that law and affect that. Is that true? Do we have the ability to affect that?
I believe that we do. I don't think there's anything in the state law that would.
Okay.
And this would be just disclosure, right?
Pardon me?
This is just disclosure. That's all we're requiring.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to make a comment about condo conversion in California. I know that where condo conversions were limited, particularly in San Francisco, when I lived in San Francisco, what you saw was tenants in common, which created a whole other nightmare. And it's kind of that thing that you try to solve one problem, and so you have increasing rents, and people can't afford their housing, so you enact rent control, and then you get these. And rent control does these good things. It protects people from significant rent increases, but it also has some negative side effects. And then you try to stop the negative side effect, and then you get this other negative side effects. And one of the really negative side effects I saw then from that cascade effect was a rise in tenants in common and sort of the implosion of those relationships, both personal and financial.
We should explain. Do you understand what tenants in common are? There's a very peculiar arrangement. It was basically to get around the fact that you couldn't convert to condominium. People would join in a partnership where they'd have rights to, in a contract, not in a deed, to occupy certain units, but there was a common mortgage for the building.
Like a co-op?
Yeah, it's kind of.
Well, yeah, but I think it was a little more complicated. So someone who came in had to assume that mortgage, and if you sold it at a higher price, you had to get a bigger mortgage for the building, but depended on the financial situation of the other owners, you couldn't get a bigger mortgage. It was very messy, but it was people were desperate to own something. But then what happened is they were banned in a few cities, these tenants in common arrangements, because they were so unwieldy, and also were just seen as an end run about the condo conversion law. And then we got a court decision, which I think was extremely strange, where a court of appeal in California said that not allowing these tenants in common arrangements was a violation of the constitutional right to privacy. And I think that was,
because they get to associate with whoever they want and purchase property however they want and divide up the use of that space. Well, we're not here to argue that, but I just want to make the point that there's other cascade effects that we should watch out for if we're thinking about these other fixes.
Right.
And I have two last things. I'm just going to put them out there and then let you finish. I wanted you to explain a little bit about what you meant by the limit for folks who have gotten substantial capital improvement increases regarding the vacancy decontrol, because that's one of the comments. Vacancy decontrol for some small percentage of the units, for a small percentage of the rent for every 5 years, except there would be maybe, and this was a comment you made, I don't think it's in the text, the limit for folks who have gotten substantial capital improvement increases. And then finally, I was wondering if you could speak to any other kinds of rent stabilization mechanisms besides this mechanism that we have that's based on historically how profitable the building was in 1991 or 92. And some things I was thinking about, like a price per square foot based on the number of bedrooms, or just generally the price per square foot. Has anybody done that? I saw this thing in the DC rent control that you can also fall back on this simple thing about 12% of your investment return or something like that. I didn't really understand that either. I didn't take very many economics classes. Or something based on the assessed value. Have you seen what other mechanisms are there that are available? So those are my two questions.
Okay, and then go, if I miss some. Okay, the return on investment standards, I feel that they're circular. Because one hand, somebody bought a building a long time ago, but they have very little investment, so a fair return on their investment could be very small. And if somebody...
Are you using this net operating expenses number instead?
Yes.
Operating income.
But we're not looking at their investment, we're looking at their net operating income as of a certain point. And if you use the return on their investment, that's dependent on which particular year they bought the building. And it's also circular, because if you buy the building today, you can pay a high price and then say, I want a return on that high price, and it's circular. You're regulating the rent, not the rent control. And nobody has worked out, I think, a return on investment system that makes sense, even though they've been trying to for the last 80 years. I haven't seen a system of regulating the rents based on the physical characteristics. I haven't seen rent control ordinances that do that, except in Italy. And there they based it on the age of the building, too, which was fantastic, because some of the buildings were 500 years old.
And do the ones who are 500 years cost more or less?
Less.
No.
Nothing. It was a wild system.
It's a comparability issue, right?
Yeah.
And square footage.
And I'd say that the rent controls really aren't systems they don't pick a fair rent and say that's the rent. They basically stabilize things. You're regulating increases. You're not regulating the initial rents. And I think that's the underlying philosophy. And if you set a rent system that set the rents based on the physical characteristics of the unit, you'd also have to take into account the desirability of the building, the desirability of the neighborhood. Or you wouldn't have to, but I mean, those are issues in the rental market. And basically, you'd be rearranging all the rents in the city. And
everyone would be unhappy.
Can I ask about that? You said that the purpose of rent control is regulating increases, not the initial rent.
Right.
And so why wouldn't you allow vacancy decontrol? Because that would allow it's just to prevent the incentive for vacancy?
Well, I'd say it's regulating the initial rent in a general sense, not saying you get a new initial rent if there's a new tenant, which with the vacancy decontrol. I mean, it's regulating the initial rent from a certain date. The rent is dependent on what it was at a certain date. It's not dependent on whether or not there's a new tenant or not.
Yeah, well, if you do vacancy decontrol, you could potentially have like 100% rent increases if they recalibrated them high enough.
But that's what
I think that's the question who are current tenants.
Right. No,
that's the question that you're responding to.
Are you regulating it for the current tenants, or are you regulating it for the whole unit, for the unit itself? And if you regulate it just for the current tenants, at some point, all the tenants in the city will have turned over, and you'll have no more affordable housing. It'll be gone. So you have to regulate it for the unit if you're going to preserve the housing over time. Go ahead.
Okay. When I said initial rent, I didn't mean for the tenant. I meant for the unit.
Well, I think that's the question, though, that your answer begs, is that, and ultimately maybe something that we argue back and forth about is the purpose to preserve affordability for the existing tenant, in which case, why wouldn't you have vacancy decontrol? Because then you would have a reset. It's true, you'd have a reset to the market rate, but then once somebody moved in, they would have stability, versus the issue of, are you trying to preserve affordable units over the long term? And if that is your goal instead, or also, how do you have equity, or how do you have a relationship between affordability and the other units or the market around you? Because if it's just based on history, and those historic relationships at this point are based on, in part, on whether or not people had a mortgage or not, And whether or not people have done capital improvements or not, there's not kind of a set sense that affordable for a two-bedroom house or a two-bedroom apartment ranges from, $600 to $800 a month. I mean, there's this tremendous range that's in there. And so, in my head, that doesn't compute all that well. And of course, I work for HUD, who says that, the fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment is X, and it doesn't matter how many square feet it is. So, I mean, that's just my response in thinking about what you had to say. Right. It kind of begs that question to me and that's the problem that I guess I have conceptually with the way the mechanism works.
I'd like to just take a minute and figure out with the council where we go from here. My sense from having listened to the discussion is that everyone is to some degree satisfied with this, or at least is willing to use this as the basis for further discussion. Am I okay with that? Yeah. So I think the next thing is to go back and then start to develop some of these individual things. I think the council is going to need some more discussion. There's a lot of stuff to chew on here, and one of the things that we might do is sort of break it into chunks. And as you noted, some of the things hang together, like 1 through 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of hang together and have to be discussed together, and then other pieces we can discuss sort of as separate items. And so I think the follow-up for the council, and I'll also look at Sarah because I know that she's going to have to do some preparation for this too, would be to start breaking it up and sort of talking about those general things. And I would agree with you, I think, starting with the first group, whether that's 1 through 3 or 1 through 4, would be the first thing to do, because that's the basis for what you're suggesting and the most fundamental difference from what we do now. So I think that's where we would start and then look at the other things also. As I was going through this, it seemed to me that one of the things, I mean, you talked to some degree about we call it hardship, you call it fair return, but I think actually you may be more accurate because that's what we're basing it on. We would be relying more on that process to take care of inequities in the current system. I mean, in the proposed system than we do in the current system. And we have been told, although we have yet to sort of figure out exactly why, that that's a very difficult process. And so one thing that I can foresee that we might need some of your help on is some more of a detailed look at our hardship/fair return process to help us figure out how to do it in a way that is fairer and more equitable and simpler. And the other thing that I was thinking about as I read this is that it probably won't take very long before people start coming. I mean, this process is simpler, but it's going to be less applicable to each individual situation. And it won't take very long before somebody comes to us and says, well, this is a good idea generally, but for me it doesn't work for X, Y, and Z. And the council is going to have to understand that going in, that if you simplify the reason the process got complicated is because, not because the council and the staff all like complication, but because we have tried, as people have come to us with individual concerns, we have tried to adjust the system to take care of those individual concerns. And now we're going back to essentially a flat tax type of system. And we are going to have to resist the next person who comes to us and says, well, your fair return isn't a fair return for me because, I had to get a 70% whatever, so, I had to get I just got a mortgage with 12% because I've got bad credit, and so therefore this is terrible for me, and you've got to change it for me. And we've got to say, we made it simple and fair and uniform, and we're very sorry, but this is the way it's going to stay. So I'm saying this more to the council than to you, because I know how we got in this situation in the first place, and we're going to have to be willing not to sort of modify it for every situation that comes along.
Is that just up until the next election?
Can I say one thing? I've asked several times during this process of considering the rent stabilization code to make sure that we are getting to a point where we take action. We know that there's a finite period of time that we will belabor this issue. And in that spirit, I would like to ask Dr. Barr one more question If you had to look down this menu, when I look down this menu, I see about 4 things that we could do immediately without very much more discussion if we wanted to accept what you've proposed. Those things would be number 1, number 3, number 9, and number 10.
Well, I think...
And then the 2 things that...
I think the suggestion was 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4 go together.
And then the things that look to me like they need additional discussion before we could take action or implement them would be 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Does that seem, in your view, accurate? Am I misreading those 4 that it seems like you've made a very specific assertion? 100% of the CPI, eliminate capital improvement process, use year 2000, and require disclosure in all real estate transactions. Those are 4 really concrete things in my view. Is that...
Okay, I think that 1, 3, and 4 are interrelated.
I understand that.
Yeah.
So you're saying you wouldn't do... You wouldn't do 1 without doing all 1, 3, and 4?
Yeah, figuring out about all of those.
Okay.
And 2 will take some time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think necessarily you'd have to think about you wait for the next rent registration to acquire this data.
Can you say that one more time?
I don't think
I'm sorry, I didn't
maybe
hear.
you should. The next rent registration for reporting is next September, and maybe you don't want to wait till then to acquire the data that would be required for number 2.
For number 2, okay. So it sounds to me like you're saying that for number 4, you have given a specific enough assertion that if we were to adopt it, it's concrete enough. You're saying for that it would be the 5 to 10.
Well,
number 4.
I think this is a question that I would like to put to the council. Do we want to do this all as one unit and enact it all at one time, or do we want to enact it piecemeal, one item at a time?
I don't think I'm prepared to make a decision about enacting or not enacting tonight.
Well, my feeling is we need to set forth a timeline by which we will be making that decision, and not let this be done, one thing at a time over the next 2 years.
Well, I'm not suggesting that it be done one thing at a time. I would like to go ahead and have a council discussion on individual items. I mean, if the council is willing to have like a 6-hour meeting, we probably could get through all of them, and I doubt if the council will be willing to do that. But I will put these on, as I said earlier, this is my priority at the moment. I will put them on future council meetings as quickly as we can get them on. We will go through this, and then once we have gone through and had a thorough discussion of all of these items, I think Dr. Barr is going to put together the legislative language, and then we'll be in a position to say yes or no to it.
Can 1, 3, and 4 be something we take action on much sooner, and then the rest be something that we discuss from now until Kingdom Come?
I'm not suggesting we take a long time discussing any of it. I think we should do all of it
I
sooner.
understand. I know that this recodification process was supposed to be quick and easy, but
I don't think we ever said it would be quick and
it
easy.
hasn't been, and we've talked about rent stabilization for a good long while. I'm very excited that it seems that the council has gotten our questions answered. We're impressed with the work and advice that you've given us, and I'd like to see us take action on 1, 3, and 4 as soon as possible.
It may be problematic just to, these things, as far as the ordinance itself is concerned, it may be problematic just to pick out certain pieces of it and stick it into the existing ordinance, because there may be other ramifications that we can't anticipate at this point in time. So from my perspective, it would be better to just to make a decision about what changes you'd like to make to the ordinance in its entirety and to do it at one time. Otherwise, we could end up creating more challenges that would have to be addressed. in an even more lengthy process.
I think the legal language drafting process would be very, very difficult to sort of take such a fundamental change and amend it onto our current ordinance. And if we threw out the whole ordinance, and then I think a squashing together new ideas with what we currently have and trying to make it a coherent system just wouldn't work. So I would agree with Sarah. I think we have to go through, make a decision on the whole thing, and move forward with the whole thing. I don't think we can just do a half person, half horse situation here.
If I may, I just wanted to also just remind the council that there is a public hearing that is scheduled for December 11th. That is being advertised in the city newsletter, and there will also be notifications sent to both tenants as well as landlords in the city. Obviously, I would suggest that the council hear that input before you get too far down the road in terms of setting your schedule, and that perhaps you might want to have another work session sometime shortly after the recess, after you've had an opportunity to hear those comments and decide at that juncture how you want to move forward from a process standpoint.
I just want to, I think, reinforce where Joy was coming from in terms of the frustration of all of this taking so long, and I hear the cautions about how to approach it, but I think it's the frustration is the fear that we'll be 4, 5, 6 months from now, and we still won't be to a point where we're making any kind of decision, and I think that's where that's coming from.
I understand that, and as I said to the council, this is my priority for right now, is to get the rest of these scheduled for council discussion. I think we have made a major step forward in getting this very fundamental and very well thought through proposal in front of us. At this point, it's not a question of figuring out what we do. It's a question of sort of looking at if the council is willing to move forward, looking at the proposal that's in front of us and figuring out, how we want to deal with some of the finer aspects of this. I'm hoping that won't take all that long. I mean, it's to a certain extent it's up to the council and not up to me. But I think we can, now that we've got this proposal on the table, we can move forward very quickly. And I continue to be very concerned about taking a new system and trying to graft pieces of it onto our old rent stabilization system. I think we would end up with something that would be unworkable. And so I think you either have to do the whole thing or stay with what we have.
I'm not going to be here, so I have the luxury of saying. I think that you've got two different levels of things here, and I know Terry says he's not comfortable to vote for anything tonight, but it seems to me that items 1, 3, 4, 7, 9, and 10 require the least amount of discussion. I mean, I think discussing with the uniform interest allowance for amortized expenses might be a discussion in itself, and deciding what to do with unused rent increases. But I think you could fundamentally change the law around those points, and while you're discussing it and getting through it, you could have work sessions that dealt with the smaller points. I mean, I think I understand people's frustration, even the landlord's frustration, and a lot of the residents' frustration that this has gone on for a long time, and there doesn't seem to be end in sight. And I think if the council members were to look at this over the next week and see whether those are elements that they were comfortable with and could move on, then you can kind of narrow on what you need to talk about a lot and what you could be putting into a shape, for actually taking action on. I think you could probably do this thing on a kind of a dual track. Because I think people, I had originally thought we were going to deal with the utility thing early on, and that's going to turn out to be the last part of this package.
Well, that's part of my concern, is I think if we go forward with some things and not stuff that people have asked us to move forward with, like the utility allowance, it's going to be, we're not going to really be dealing with the problems that have been brought before us and that we agree are concerns.
But you already conceded that the utility allowance, well, at least his suggestion would be that you're not even going to visit that one.
No, I don't think his suggestion is that we not visit it. My understanding is that the suggestion is that we put in place now a process for dealing with it, but that we actually we implement the process once we get the data. But we put the process into effect up front. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but yes, I would say that. And I'd also say start collecting the data as soon as possible.
Right. Which I don't think we can legally do until we have a law that says that landlords have to provide it to us.
I don't think they're going to resist.
That's an easy thing for you guys to do. Pass a resolution and say that you have to start submitting the data.
I'd be happy to.
Well, one would hope so.
The other one suggestion I have is number 10 is a different kind of law than a rent control law.
Is a different kind of what?
Law than
Right.
part of the rent control. That I think you should separate. And my guess is you're going to have no dispute about that, so it should just be a separate ordinance that you could probably discuss for 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a fairly good idea. I guess the question would be how fast can we pull something like that together?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Which
A number 10, which is requiring disclosure of rent stabilization information on the sales of rental property. You're right. It's a good idea, and we can do that fairly quickly.
Somebody please draft.
Yes. And I'm assuming that there's no argument on the council to doing that.
No. Can I just reinforce that Mark's proposal is a good one. He's asserted that this is all of a piece. And, I agree that we don't want to pick apart this and then pass some legislation and then pick apart other parts and then pass some more legislation. I do think we need to move forward, and if we could get this nailed down and done over the next 2 months, if that was the kind of turnaround time that we could be guaranteed, I'm comfortable with that. I also like the idea of passing a resolution to, get utility costs from landlords, and
I think
passing a resolution to get this real estate transaction moving. Those to me seem like good concrete actions that will nail down some of the pieces that really don't need to be moving parts anymore. And that's really what I'm asking for. I'm not, I hope you won't mischaracterize the point I'm trying to make here. And
I think we can do it in a couple of months if we start the couple of months count in January, because you understand the council's not going to be meeting during the month.
Yes, but the city staff is going to be working on a daily basis. And so the council not being here to meet in, from the middle of December until early January doesn't mean that city staff work won't be putting the pieces in place that we need to move forward on this decision.
Right, but I'm assuming that council's going to want to discuss these things and not just tell staff to implement them without any council discussion. So in answer to your question, if we're talking about probably having them ready for enactment in March, I think that's quite feasible. I think that is feasible to do. Does that, I assume that works with your schedule?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Ken can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the utility data we need is just a decent sample that we could get voluntarily from people who would contribute to it.
Okay.
Great, draft a letter.
If we think we can do that, I think that's good.
If we're doing, if the council wants to do, they don't want to have the increases based on individual buildings, utility use as opposed to.
Yeah, I think you can.
My question
Barb is saying that that's the feedback she needs and that the work can proceed.
Yeah, there seems to be a consensus on the council that you want to proceed with at least examining the options on the utilities, and I know Dr. Barr has indicated that getting some data is sort of instrumental to making that decision, and that's certainly something we can proceed with.
I don't think it should be.
And draft number 10.
If you can make it not voluntary, I don't know how quickly you could do that. It would be better because, so you don't get a biased sample.
Sure.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that you may recall from the S&Is earlier this fall and late summer, we sent out a survey to all the landlords to give us some indication of what utilities they were paying and for what types of services. And included with that was, please send us your utility bills so that we can start collecting some of the information that we need. And I just confirmed it with Linda and Jean, and we got maybe a handful of the people that actually they filled out the form, though we're calling people now to follow up on the ones that didn't complete it, but very few actually voluntarily gave us their utility bills.
But did the letter say we're doing this so we can consider whether or not
Yes,
we
it
adjust
did.
this for more equitable?
Yes.
And they still didn't turn it in?
Right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to ask them to sign a waiver that would allow you to collect the information directly from the utility company? Because maybe it's that they don't want to pull together the records, and maybe if they just put their signature on the waiver, you could get the information. Is that possible?
We can investigate that with the utility company and see if that would work on their end. We've get mixed messages when we contact the utility company about who can access the information. Yeah.
I'd be happy to give you my database of my utility information, if that helps.
Database?
Yes.
The other
But
thing,
that's different.
I mean, for some utilities, sometimes it's been possible to get aggregate data directly, where they'll only give the owner's permission to data for individual buildings, but they will give aggregate data. You might have to pay them to do that or something.
You mean aggregate data for specified addresses or aggregate data for everyone in the city of Tacoma Park?
I think for specified addresses, for example, let's say
Okay.
for water expenses where we want specified group of buildings, like 300 buildings.
Okay, because that would work, because if you were just doing a jurisdiction, then it would be, you have multi-unit buildings and single-family buildings. But if we could just do specified addresses, that might be
That's what I
a
mean.
way to explore also. Okay, those are all very good ideas. So I think where we are is the council wants to move forward with the suggestions that we are going to try and do this within, so we have the legislation ready for consideration by the council early March, whatever the beginning, I can't remember it is.
How about late February?
And that we will move right now with getting information on the utility costs, and that you, Ken, will draft the disclosure law that we need, with whatever help you need.
I'll give them.
Okay.
But all in the next week.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Well, I think this has been a very good discussion. I feel as if we've moved dramatically forward on this issue. And I very much appreciate your help in sort of helping us take a whole fresh look at this. I think it's been extremely useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.